Right, a great welcome to Neal Ascherson. Bill Schwarz, Saul Dubow, behind the camera, meeting Neal at Magdalene on College, Cambridge, on the 12th of March. We've got a big night ahead of us because of certain things in Parliament, but Neal has very kindly agreed to come to talk to us about aspects of empire. The three of us met in Gibraltar some months ago at a conference, and this in some ways continues the conversation that we began.
Okay, thank you very much. Neal, you've written a range of extraordinary books. Your journalism, I've probably seen a tiny segment on. So there are many things we aren't going to be able to talk about here. It seems very likely that we won't really get much chance to talk about Central Europe, or about Poland, or about many other things. What we're thinking is we might begin just asking questions about historical consciousness and where your historical sensibilities arose. Then maybe to the question of the British Empire, moving on to a little bit on Brexit Britain and possibly think about the relationship to the end of empire to Brexit Britain. And then we'll have to say something a little bit at the end about Scotland. We can't not say anything about Scotland. So could I begin by just asking a very difficult but very broad question about where you think your historical sensibilities arose? Do you always have them as a child? You talk about your mother's interest in Scottish history and Scottish folklore and so on. Did you read Walter Scott as a child?
No, I didn't read Walter Scott, but it certainly would come through, mostly through my mother, to some extent through my father. My father, a naval officer, but he was engaged in a bit of history because he was involved in the intervention during the Civil War in Russia. So he knew a lot about Russian history, which he talked about. My mother talked certainly about Scottish history, and at an early age I was being read history books like Scotland's Story, which is a famous disconnected series of gory romantic anecdotes, which you have no sense of how one episode relates to another, but the illustrations were terrific. And so I suppose that was a general, I think also the kind of times in which I was a child were times in which people talked a great deal about, were very conscious of history and talked about it. Of course, when one says history, that's selective, so it was almost entirely British, either British, English or Scottish history. And apart from the Russian exception, I didn't learn much about the rest of the world.
But you learned history formally at Cambridge?
Yes, I chose to read history, that's right.
And do you remember what prompted you to choose history? What prompted you to read history as an undergraduate?
What I remember is being told rather offensively by Christopher Morris, who was then in charge of the sort of first year history undergraduates, that I know perfectly well you've all chosen history as an easy option, but it's not. I'm going to show you, etc. I chose it because I was already interested in revolutions and resistances and that kind of thing, and sort of reviving elements of the past, rebellion. I had a romantic view.
Did you think of history as a critical discipline?
Did I what?
Did you think of history as a critical discipline? Did you think of it as about argument and criticism, or did you think
No, I hadn't really hoisted that in. I mean, I was quite surprised gradually to find that there were schools of history or interpretation of history who disagreed with one another. You quite soon learned that at Cambridge, but I wasn't aware of that before. So for me, it was the past, what happened, vivas, what happened really.
And did you find yourself at Cambridge aligning yourself with any particular school of history?
I wouldn't have said so. I mean, I was being tutored by several people, Noel Allen and Eric Hobsbawm were the main influences. Noel Allen's line on history was very much, it's all a matter of who knew whom and certain families who tended to reproduce themselves in genius and power. And I was a bit wary of that. Eric's approach, which was about the people in history, interested me and impressed me much more, I have to say. But I think, a lot of the history I wanted to learn, it wasn't for sale, in fact, at Cambridge. It just wasn't on the curriculum. So I found myself, special subject. The previous year there'd been a special subject in the revolutions of 1848, which I thought was great. By the time I got there, it was off. And instead I found I had to do the Elizabethan church settlement, which I would, in some ways it really taught me a great deal about what you might call Anglitude.
Were you aware as an undergraduate, did you take any courses in imperial history or expansion of Europe, I think as it was called then?
No, there was nothing like that. No, at school there had been obviously some basic, I was at Eton and the history taught there was certainly quite conservative, straightforward, but it certainly included the empire, the history of the empire. From a conservative, imperial point of view, as you might say, but the basic facts were mostly there.
It seems to me that in your writing there are many varieties of different historical sensibility. So in Death of Fronsac, for example, it's a beautiful kind of ethnographic, textured, detailed reconstruction of Greenock in the 1940s. Beautifully done. But then if you think also about Stone Voices, your reflections on Scotland and its fate and future, you seem much more preoccupied with the question of kind of deep history, with archaeological time.
Yes, that's right.
And you indeed are a professional archaeologist in some ways.
Well, I would qualify that. I've always been an amateur archaeologist. At the age of 15 I was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland.
When you were 15?
Yeah.
And you're still a member?
I'm the oldest. I've been longer fellow than anybody else. So I've achieved that. No, but so I've done a certain amount of field work, been drawn into it. But I was always fascinated and excited by it. And in Argyll, I was very much under the patronage, so to speak, of an extraordinary woman called Marian Campbell, who was, I always felt, in after years I felt, she was very much like a kind of type of Central European 19th century small aristocrat. So she was a landowner, she was a clan figure, of minor kind, she was fanatical nationalist, she was an archaeologist, she was involved in local politics. She was an Argyllshire councillor, as then was, and she also wrote novels and poetry. So this is the kind of figure which you don't really, well, I think you find it in Ireland. You certainly find that, 19th century Hungary or the Czech lands, Poland, that kind of smaller aristocracy and their connection with cultural nationalism, different kinds, and their interest in the past, archaeology is.
So she was active. Was she a patron, or was she of the
Well,
society?
she was a friend of my mother. So when we were little girls, that's how I first knew her. But she took an interest in me, and taught me about archaeology basically. And then, when discovered I was interested, made me a fellow. So that's how I became a fellow. I'd done some stuff on my own about sandhill sites, as they're called in Isle of Coll. We used to go for holidays. So that's how it all began. And then when I was at Eton, I was also became a great friend of a man called Robert Erskine, or Boy, who he was a real prodigy. At the age of 16, he was a leading authority on a particular epoch of Anglo-Saxon coinage. He was terrific, yes, and he was very learned indeed. He still is.
I'm interested in different ways you have of approaching the history of nationhood and the history of nationalism. So on the one hand, you give these archaeological readings, which kind of have these long, deep subterranean histories. And then in your other voice, you're very attached to the title of Gwyn Williams' 1985 book, When Was Wales?
Yeah.
So you're asking, when was Scotland? But that's much more conjunctural and kind of agent way of understanding history. So it's just, I'm interested in about how you can balance these two different perspectives of historical approach.
It was really, I think it was archaeology, which and the development of theoretical archaeology, which I was experiencing, in fact, in the Institute of Archaeology in London, UCL, that really enlightened me about nationalism in many ways, because the central thing about nationalism is the old proverb about this is my grandfather's axe. My father gave it a new head and I gave it a new handle. This is my grandfather's axe. And this understanding that nations in one sense are not fictions, but they are artifacts, and they're imaginative artifacts in certain respects. Nonetheless, the fact that they are much of their past or the accepted past may be mythological or invented or constructed, doesn't in fact affect the solidity and intensity of national feeling and its loyalties. And so it was this ironical combination which is certainly in Stone Voices, but it's also in another book which is Black Sea, which is about nationalism largely, not exclusively, but it's partly so. So, I mean, the thing about the advantage coming from Scotland, because one of the first things you have to, it took me some time to realise, I think, that there was something different about Scottish nationalism, which is that to say, is there a Scottish nation, is not, it is not the same as the search for a Welsh nation in the past, because of course nobody ever said seriously that there was a single ethnic Scottish nationality, because there never was, and people talked about a kingdom of Scotland long before they talked about a Scottish people, because it was composed of so many different, well, not so many, but let's say half a dozen ethnically distinct units, many of which were quite incomprehensible to one another in different cultures. but were united eventually by common loyalty.
Did you read when it came out in Hobsbawm's invention of nationalism?
Ben Nicholson. Yeah.
No, the Hugh Trevor Roper piece about the Scottish.
yeah.
Did you take
Invention
that?
of Tradition.
Invention of Tradition. The Hugh Trevor Roper piece, which looked at the sort of the fraudulent invention of the Scottish kilt. Did that?
Yes, I did. I read that. Yeah.
You didn't think much of it.
No, because it's very superficial. It doesn't take on board, the dual reality which you have to take on board, which is that much is imagined, much is made up, and yet much of what is made up and imagined is, in another sense, deeply real and has to be taken very seriously. So, he doesn't do that.
Can we move to empire since we're talking?
I've got one last
Why not?
question, if that's all right. This is a curiosity rather than a kind of big intellectual question. I just wonder how much imaginative fiction has shaped your historical sensibilities. Whether from Central Europe or from Balzac or Scotland.
Well, it's amusing that you should ask that. I was at Eton. I was an Eton scholar, of course, but nonetheless I was at Eton. And in those days, Eton was still, in some respects, living in the 18th century. English wasn't taught, so there was no English literature wasn't the subject at all. In order to do some of the national exams, I seem to remember. No, we didn't do. We did a Shakespeare play, but that was just an act, So I left at the age of 18, emerged into the world, never having heard of George Eliot, vaguely having heard of Trollope, because some people said that was what a gentleman ought to read.
Harold Macmillan.
I hadn't read any Dickens. I had read some novels of Scott, but basically I hadn't read any of the English or Conrad, anything like that, none of that. And
But
I
since
knew
then-
almost nothing about it. George Eliot never had of.
But since then,
Yeah.
you've read very widely in English and Central European fiction, and it must have shaped your thinking deeply, isn't it?
Well, yes, but it's very, my fiction reading has been very unsystematic. A lot of it has been trying to catch up on what I should have been familiar with, And when I arrived at Cambridge, I found all these people talking about things which authors, which I had no knowledge about at all. I had read some French stuff. I think I'd read some Flaubert by then. I've read quite a lot of poetry. Perhaps too much. That's right, because I got drifted into reading quite sentimental stuff. I read a lot of G.K. Chesterton. I read a lot of John Masefield.
Housman? Did you read Housman?
No, I didn't. I couldn't take that. No, it just put me off, Something about it immediately put me off. But Masefield I now think is underrated.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a revival, certainly of some of the prose. Very interesting writer, actually.
Right.
Some of the long romantic poems are a bit sick-making, I think, these days. But certainly I devoured all that, yeah. And that was in my teens. I suppose you could say something I discovered for myself. And then I remember buying a book by Catherine Mansfield when I was probably about 14 or something. That made a big impression on me.
Gosh.
But it's all kind of scattered haphazard. Trying to think. Well, then a bit more systematic was, again, this is kind of rather typical of a certain kind of country, which is rather un-English, I guess. But in Scotland, there was a man who drove the post van in Loch Gilphead, and called Pat, and he used to give me lifts occasionally when I wanted to get to Glasgow. Pat was, I think he was in the CP, but he was also a nationalist, which was quite, could say contradictory, but actually a lot of people combined those in those days. It was kind of late 40s, 50s. And he was very concerned with Scottish culture and literature. And in those days, a great deal of it was almost impossible to get hold of, because it had gone out of print. It had never been widely printed, and all that. And so he ran a sort of almost unofficial lending library, almost as if the stuff was Samistan. And so he told me about Lewis Crassick Gibbon, and so I put myself on the list, as it were, and then eventually my turn, and I got the look at Sunset Song or whatever it was, you see. And I mean, that's again kind of, I don't think you'd find it down here, that sort of
very good
situation.
Yeah.
Or that kind of personality. Anybody was driving around the countryside, you see, in his van. He was in contact, all kinds of people, and he was using that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you would accompany him in the van to Gypsum, then just...
Very good. Do you want to get on to empire?
Well, we've started talking about nationalism, and you're a young man at this crucial moment of decolonisation, and I know when you're at Cambridge, I'm not quite sure, you join or you become a representative of the Uganda National Congress, is that right?
Well, I became the propaganda secretary.
How did that happen? Can you tell us the story?
Well, I'd known two of my friends, and my best friend at Cambridge, in fact, was a Ugandan. He was at King's the same as I was. And so it was a time of political crisis. Uganda was still a British protectorate, but there had been a crisis in which of nationalist upsurge for independence, in the course of which the Kabaka, the king of Buganda, had been exiled by the British. And anyway, a bit later, after I left Cambridge, for various reasons, I went to Uganda and decided I'd go and see these two, and so I landed up in Uganda at King's College, Dubow, and where one of them was teaching, my greatest friend. I stayed there for a bit and got immediately involved in Uganda National Congress stuff, and we'd been doing this before, because we'd been, as I said in that piece of paper, sitting, writing constitutions, for the Hancock Commission at the time when the British was being very serious and solemn about how could one advance, a certain degree of self-representation in Uganda, which will satisfy this, that, and the other, So they were requiring submissions, so we all submitted constitutions which we made up.
Did you meet Keith Hancock?
Hancock? No, not personally. No, I didn't.
So presumably, I'm guessing, by being propaganda secretary of the Congress, you were pretty much on the same side as Obote, but actually opposed to the Kabaka. Would that be right?
Well, my feelings about the Kabaka, and those were actually my particular Ugandan, who were Baganda too, friends, was a bit ambiguous. Which was, there was a sort of very deep kind of chthonic loyalty somewhere, and but nonetheless they did think he was a playboy, and that the kind of authority he exerted, which was ancient magical and extremely authoritarian was not really what the new Uganda should be about. However,
Did you encounter Andrew Cohen?
yeah, certainly. Yes, I did.
And?
Well, Andrew Cohen was, I want to put this slightly in sequence, what happened. I mean, I went to Uganda, after a time became involved in the Uganda National Congress work again, and then they said, could I take on the job of being propaganda secretary? This was for practical reasons, which is that I was white. And if you went to an Indian printer and said, could you please print all these leaflets saying, Brits get out and we want independence now, you know, he would immediately report you to the police and refuse to do it if you were black. If you were white, of course, oh, wait a minute. It was that simple to start with, really. So shortly after that, I got into a deportation notice from the special branch in Uganda, because I helped to organise a conference at Makerere, which was it was the first time really that UNC representatives from all over the Uganda, the protectorate, came into one place and talked to each other, you know, what we should do. So I got this notice and I kind of appealed. I did already know them because, you know, it's a very small community, and so Andrew Cohen was large, I suppose Jewish, liberal. In fact, I think he'd been an apostle.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think he was a Cambridge apostle. Anyway.
You were an apostle too?
Yes, I was.
Oh.
And he, you know, I was immediately in the sort of circuit to be asked to his.
And it came very close to bringing Macmillan's government to an end. And I think it's only in retrospect that people are beginning to see how enormous that crisis, political crisis, which was a colonial crisis, was actually registered in the home state. Were you conscious of that at the time?
Yes.
Of the power of these colonial reverberations within Westminster?
Well, because of MacLeod.
Yeah.
And we, there was a group of us, Commonwealth correspondents, and we used to go almost every day to get briefed by Ian MacLeod, who would sort of give us a drink and talk with terrible frankness, you know, about what Roy was up to, the latest from Roy. And he was a happy warrior, you know, he was enjoying it, he was going to get what he wanted. That was his view. No, I mean, he was very enormously likable. And people, I mean, of course, people become likable when they open their hearts to journalists. You know.
Indeed so.
I've known a few.
So MacLeod appealed to you. Right? MacLeod appealed to you. You formed a relationship. It was you enjoyed each other's.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not the only one, but I was one of the journalists he knew and liked or trusted, or trusted. How much he didn't tell us, I don't know.
Duncan Sands?
He certainly told us lots of.
Did you meet Duncan Sands?
No.
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 I think you'd find him less congenial.
Duncan Sands, that's a hard man.
And what about Macmillan?
Well, never came in contact with him.
Did you think that MacLeod was clearly a big influence on Macmillan. Did you think that Macmillan simply saw the African empire as an inconvenience that they wanted to get rid of? Did you follow the Wind of Change tour?
I didn't. No, I didn't. Partly because Scotsman, I was a Commonwealth correspondent. Scotsman had no money, so I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. Indeed, I wasn't. Well, I was invited to go once on a PR trip to Mauritius by the then Prime Minister of Mauritius, but the Scotsman wouldn't let me go because Eric Mackay said you'd need an awful lot of pocket money. So that was it. Everything was going to be paid for, you know. Or you'd need a lot of pocket money. I mean, that stayed with them, mind you. I know it's proverbial, but, you know, many, many years later, I mean, they paid for me to hire a bright orange Volkswagen and drive across the Namib Desert, you know.
Blimey.
But when I charged them for a pair of socks I bought in CNN in Johannesburg, they wouldn't pay for it.
What were you doing on the Volkswagen in the Namib Desert?
Well, reporting all those, do you remember those torture stuff? Dirk Mudge?
Oh God, yes, the
All
Namibian,
that.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
That's right.
This is the negotiations towards the end of
Towards the end
Southwest Africa.
Yeah. And first of all, the fighting going on, of course, up north in Schwarz. And I went up to that as well. But, I mean, Windhoek was the weird comedy of people, of course, the Germans complicating it, and that's a whole other story. But, anyway,
But I mean, by this time you knew Germany very well.
yes,
So you must have gone to places like Swakopmund and Luderitz and seen
Yeah.
this expatriate German community.
yeah.
And
It's, oh dear, the ones who used to throw this party on Hitler's birthday.
right,
Yeah.
yes.
Can I ask? Can I ask where Belgium came from? Where Leopold II
Yeah.
came from?
Why I did that?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because, well, one, because it was 1960,
Mm-hmm.
Congo independence.
Mm-hmm.
But two, because when I was in Uganda, I did meet a couple of young Africans who'd come through from the Congo, the Belgian Congo, and they were just extraordinary because they wore wonderfully kind of exotic clothes, really. I mean, they were like beautiful, shiny, brilliant brown leather jackets, and you know, they were very fashionably clothed, which, you know, Africans in Uganda in those days were not. Rather respectable kind of Church of England sort of way of dressing. Everybody had, you know, blazers and ties and things. They were these garish, rather Frenchified. And with talking to them, you discovered that there was a great big hole in their heads, metaphorically, where politics ought to have been. They had no political ideas at all. They didn't know anything about, hadn't thought about what's going to happen. Some of them were quite well read.
Can you put a date on this? This is late 50s?
This was 1956.
Right.
Yeah. And in many ways sophisticated kids, but politically absolutely null. Nothing. And I and Ugandan friends found this very strange. Of course, the whole thing came out in the wash. This is Belgians, the way Belgium dealt with it.
How did you
Didn't
explain?
do it.
How did you explain that to yourself?
How do I explain it?
How did you explain this lack of political consciousness amongst this?
Well, deliberate
Colin.
Belgian policy, which was, you know, to either you became completely évolué, Belgianized, or you got nothing. So they weren't taught to think about themselves, you know.
Well, there were barely any secondary schools, and there were barely any secondary schools, and no university, as I recall.
Well, there was a sort of college somewhere in Kivu, I think. What was it? It was, I can't remember its name now. In fact, there was an atomic.
There was an atomic
institution
reactor.
of some
Yeah,
sort, wasn't
yeah,
there?
there was. Yeah.
But how much is Lumumba present in your Leopold III book?
Well, he's not. He's not in the book.
No, I know. No, but how much was he in your head as you were writing the book? I know he's not in the book.
Oh, quite a lot. But on the other hand, the book is not really about Africa primarily.
About Belgium.
It's not about the fate of the Congolese peoples. Yeah. It's about colonialism of a particular kind, and there's an extraordinary vision which Leopold had very shrewdly, which is, I can make monarchy survive into the 20th century by endowing it with huge sums of money, making it economically so powerful
Yeah.
that although we can have parliamentary democracy, yet a parliament can't challenge the power of the monarchy to initiate policy and initiate new directions for the economy, including new colonies, of course.
Do you remember you wrote this piece in the LRB about Lumumba?
Sorry?
You wrote this piece in the LRB 10 or 20 years ago about Lumumba, and you said, do you remember saying that he has this presence?
Oh,
that
yes.
everyone you were talking to, lock their windows in case the spirit of Lumumba would come in the night and molest the white woman.
Lumumba had, he developed a strange sexual kind of connotation with people. Certainly, even in London, I remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was shocking.
That women particularly became just twitchy. I mean, almost, they dreamt about Lumumba.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They say.
So he had, the whole episode had an extraordinary power, and he did. I saw him once.
Did you?
Yeah, because he came to London.
Oh, of course.
I can't remember why.
And this is when Hume was writing the memo to the State Department saying that we can throw him to the crocodiles. Which I'm sure you didn't know about then, but has become common knowledge subsequently.
Yeah, yes. I remember him because I saw him at the airport, that's right, it was at Heathrow, and there was a crowd of us looking, and then there were all these people. He looked at them and thought, who are they taking photographs? They're not journalists. I know. They were South African, actually, some of them.
Oh.
Yeah.
And did you hear him speak?
Went up and to say, who are you? And they got very nasty.
Did you hear Lumumba speak?
No, he
I
didn't
just
speak
wondered
at that point.
about his charisma and
People
whether
looking
that
at him
was
slightly sort
palpable.
of angry and bewildered, and it was too led away into a limousine, I think, as far as I remember.
Did you go to the Congo during the crisis?
No.
Do you want to move on?
Have you got any more to ask about Empire?
Not
Do you
just at
think
the
we've
moment.
done the Empire? Would you like a break and a cup of tea, Neil?
Well, how are we getting on? I mean,
Well, it's 5 o'clock. We've been going for about 45 minutes. We could have a quick break.
I'll have a 5-minute break. Yeah. No, look at my mouth.
Okay. Neil, you also spent quite a lot of time in southern Africa. You said you met the dreadful Dirk Mudge and all those, which actually turn out to be quite important negotiations. Many people now see them as kind of precursors of the idea of a possible negotiated solution. You didn't see it like that at the time.
Didn't seem like that at the time.
No. Hugh Tracy.
Yeah. Well, I knew Hugh Tracy because he was a friend and patron, really, of John Blacking, who was a friend of mine, who I met at King's. And
Blacking was an anthropologist.
well, he was an
Ethnomusicologist.
ethnomusicologist.
Yes.
And Tracy, I think, was the first sort of founder of ethnomusicology, I suppose. And anyway, I don't know. But did Tracy found Gallo Africa, the records?
I'm not sure if he found it, but he was certainly associated with it. And Gallo Africa was an important outlet for black music.
Yeah, that was the thing. And wonderful stuff. Not just South African, of course, largely Congolese. Yeah. And so at Cambridge, got to know John Blacking, and through him Hugh Tracy, who came, I remember him turning up, and was able to get hold of quite a few Gallo Africa records. Wonderful.
So who was Hugh Tracy? I don't know.
Jean Bosco Mwenda, guitarist.
Hugh Tracy, I think he was, as you say, he was an ethnomusicologist. He did a lot of collection of music instruments.
British or South African?
I don't actually know.
What, Tracy?
Hugh Tracy, yeah. He was South African, wasn't he?
I thought he was.
Yes, yes.
Maybe
yes.
wrong.
Yeah.
John Blacking wasn't, but John Blacking then got into big trouble because of ethnic, he was done under the mixed races
Yes,
for
yes.
having an affair with an Indian lady.
Yes. I think he came to Oxford, didn't he? Settle in Oxford, if I remember
I think
correctly.
it was in Cambridge.
Cambridge.
But then he settled finally in Queen's, Belfast.
Right, right.
Excuse me.
Were you? I mean, when you say you knew, did you develop an interest in African music? Did you used to go to clubs
Yeah,
and stuff
I
like
was
that?
crazy about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And because I have some of these Gallo Africa records.
Oh, you must hang on to those.
I haven't anymore. I mean, these were all 78s,
You should have hung on to
a
them.
century ago.
Yeah.
But people used to come to my rooms in Kings, Africans from all kinds of different parts, just to listen.
Did you go to clubs?
No, I never did that. I mean, I'm not sure there was African music in clubs, and certainly in Cambridge at that time. Not that I knew of.
And what did you make of South Africa?
Gosh. Well, the first thing to say about it is it's electric. I mean, this state of intensified, raised consciousness among almost everybody of every ethnic background was absolutely extraordinary, and you suddenly began to live but twice as fast. Of course, this is under the apartheid regime. Much of what you're doing is either clandestine or sort of semi, or taking some sort of risk, or putting somebody else at risk, or whatever it might be. So it was, yeah. I mean, in many ways, I'd read so much about it already, because I thought, when did I first go there? Oh yeah, I first went to South Africa in 1975, that's right. But by then, of course, because Britain was so obsessed with South Africa, particularly the British media.
Why was that? I've been talking this morning to Fergal Keane about exactly that question, about why South Africa figured so strongly in the British imaginary.
It's because the British were induced somehow to feel a sense of responsibility for it. And of course that started in 1948 with the Afrikaner, the Nationalist Party victory.
You don't think that part of that was an expiation of guilt over a much longer engagement going back to, Boer War, Zulu War and so forth?
Well, I've wondered about that. I don't think so, as a matter of fact. I don't think so. I think that British people were helped by media and politicians to settle back into quite a complacent feeling about their relationship with South Africa.
But that's exactly what I mean by expiation, the complacency.
Well, expiation for the complacency.
Okay.
But,
I mean, wasn't it convenient for many British people to say there's this terrible thing called apartheid, and it's run by Afrikaners, who are these 17th century Calvinists who don't know better, need to learn the ways of the modern world. And so, I mean, that was very much the tenor of Macmillan's address in Cape Town.
it may be that the so-called reconciliation with the Afrikaner community, which was followed the Boer War, only went skin deep.
Oh, I think it went very deep. I think it persuaded many British people. I do. I think that was the making of the Milner Kindergarten, and many of the schemes that we see later on in Central Africa and so forth are built on an idea that these very clever British undergraduates who served Milner, having understood the power of colonial nationalism and having brought the great 1910 Union into being, could now practice this kind of high-level negotiation at many different levels, including the Commonwealth, including a view of decolonisation and so forth. But that's just my view.
I see that. I was just wondering, but I think it was a wrong speculation to think that there were, in fact, still suppressed resentments about the enemy and the Boer War, which were lightly covered over by the reconciliation, and then sort of the nationalist victory in 1948 suddenly allowed these prejudices to spring to the surface again. That's probably quite wrong, though.
Well, but let's start in the 70s. So you go in the 70s. By that time, there's a new, as it were, view led by academics, but also journalists. You may know Jonathan Steele.
Yeah, very well.
Christopher Gurney, people like that, who were advancing the idea that actually Britain's relations with apartheid were fundamentally about supporting a capitalist system, and that the true ruthlessness of apartheid was not just about race, but was actually about the defense of an economic system in which Britain was complicit. Did you enter into those kinds of debates with people like...
Yeah.
You did?
Yes. Sure, but I mean, that's not the answer to how rapidly, after 1948, British public opinion became agonised by what was happening in South Africa, which is very strange. I mean, of course, in many ways, very fortunate, or admirable, or whatever or appropriate. Nonetheless, it is rather strange, and it needs explaining.
I think it does. I think it is strange, and I think it does need explaining. One of the things that I sometimes show students, you probably remember a writer called H.V. Morton, who wrote lots of books called In Search Of and so forth. Do you remember as he tootled around his motor car? He actually moves to South Africa in 1948 because he thinks Britain is finished, and he wants to join, rather like those post-war emigrants from Britain going to Rhodesia for the good life. He actually identifies with apartheid. So I think that question of why British sensibility moves against apartheid is an extremely interesting question, and can't easily be answered through simple responses as it was bad.
I mean, the push had a heavily religious flavour.
Yes, and Michael Scott.
Well, Michael Scott and other, churches, other denominations, other religious leaders piled in very rapidly. And certainly the Observer newspaper was not the first. I mean, also, the old News Chronicle, for example, run by Quakers,
right,
which finally folded up when I think it folded up in about 1960. But still up to then, and then Daily Herald, as then was, and so on. So a lot of the press rapidly picked this up and were enormously critical about what had happened. And yet, you see, a few years before, there was little Princess Elizabeth going and
47, yes,
and tremendous complacency about this. I don't know if she ever met any blacks at all,
no,
any Africans in South Africa. And everyone thought that was wonderful. And we get on so well, and the name of Schwarz was so wonderful, and everybody respected it. And then suddenly, it all changed very, very quickly.
Well, it changes in stages. There's the treason trial, there's Sharpeville, and then there's the formation of the anti-apartheid movement. Did you have much contact as a journalist with people in the anti-apartheid movement in Britain? Some.
Yeah.
And what was your view of anti-apartheid as an organisation?
Well, the movement, the masses of decent, high-minded, idealistic people on the street, great. They were wonderful. When you got down to some of the leading figures, particularly some of the representations in London, then it became dicey, because of course some of them turned out to be double agents, as you know.
Yeah. But I sense from what you're saying, it's not just looking at the double agents. There was something perhaps about some of the leaders that you didn't like or disapproved of or felt was...
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, there was nothing about the anti-apartheid movement that I thought, looking back, was it?
Did you feel it odd that there were so many white people involved in the anti-apartheid movement, representing the ANC, for example?
I don't think I did really. I sort of assumed there were so few Africans, South Africa, there were any other Africans around in Britain at the time. But certainly the kind of ANC element in it was, I mean, they then developed, of course, as you remember much better than I do, I'm sure, a series of intricate and savage quarrels. The Kitsons.
The Kitsons, Norma Kitson, David Kitson, yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And these were, it involved with Ruskin College, wasn't it, as well. And this embittered a lot of people. They became involved with all kind of sectarian underground people trying to cut each other's throats. You know.
It was very much a product of a particular exilic moment and particular interpretations, whether you're a Trotskyist or a Marxist or a nationalist or an Africanist or a Pan-Africanist and so forth.
Yeah.
Did you get? You knew the Kitsons?
I think I met, it's a long ago, I did meet one of them. I think I met him, but I don't remember well. I think so.
Did you meet Oliver Tambo, Joe Slovo?
No, I didn't. No.
Those people.
No.
I know we're not going to talk about this the rest of the afternoon, but if you can just skip ahead to 1994, you write an absolutely, if you don't mind me saying so, I read it last night, brilliant piece at the 1994 inauguration of Mandela, and you have, I can't remember exactly the formulation, but you have one of those kind of undergraduate essay ready characterizations of Mandela. Partly you say that he has the fortune, I think, of timing. You talked about timing. I think you don't seem to have been quite so impressed as many journalists were by the charisma. There's a certain kind of hesitancy that you have.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that piece actually.
I shall have to dig it up. I mean, it's a brilliant piece. It's a wonderful piece.
Well, thanks for saying so, but I don't recall it. And I don't recall feeling reservations about Mandela. No. I may have felt reservations about what was going to happen, or whether things could be kept under control, or whether there's going to be some massive backlash or whatever. But that's different.
I think you make the point that he was an idea as well as a political person. But I shall dig that up. But maybe we want to
I can't remember it.
Go back in time a bit.
But I used to, the other people I knew in South Africa, which was so, of course, so different. Because some of the people in the Durban, Natal trade union movement, the underground movement.
In the Durban strikes, the 1973 strikes?
That kind of thing. There was, I can't remember, they tried to set up a new set of trade unions. I think particularly textile workers.
That's right.
Women.
Yeah.
And there was,
the frame factory.
Fozia Fisher.
Yes.
Who was married to Rick
Turner. Did you ever meet Rick Turner?
Yeah, I did. I had a long talk with him.
What did you make of Rick Turner?
Oh, he was terrific, actually.
Can you say more? But he's now a figure that people are very interested in. Of course, he had that close relationship with Steve Biko, and they used to spend a lot of time arguing.
Yeah.
What did you make of Turner? He was a philosopher. He'd been in Paris.
Yeah, Steve Biko was out with my knowledge. I mean, I never came across him. But what I remember about Rick Turner is how much I liked him and admired him. I thought he was excellent, but that was probably about a month or a year, or about a year before he was killed. And I thought his book was very good, also excellent, still is. Yeah, and then Fozia, who I first knew actually when she was doing trade union stuff near Durban. And that was awful. Clandestine, you had to go there in the middle of the night, these muddy roads. And then of course she came back here. She went to the University of Kingston on Thames or something.
I didn't follow. That trail goes cold for me over there. But that's a fascinating moment, because that, in a sense, was the revival, what they sometimes call the Durban moment now, the revival of the sort of the modern anti-apartheid struggle. There was that sort of long hiatus from the end of Sharpeville to about 72, 73, Durban strikes, black consciousness, 76, 77, Soweto uprising, and then of course the re-emergence of trade unionism in the 1980s. So that's an incredibly important time to have been there. But I think we're running ahead, and you want to.
No, it's fine.
But take us back.
You start talking about South Africa, you can go on.
Yes.
All right. Because
It wasn't part of our script.
No, of course it's part of our script.
everything in there. You know.
I know.
What did you think of the African National Congress as an organisation? Or
Well, I mean, I didn't come across them except in London, where it had some. I can't remember. I got it the wrong side of somebody. I think I may have said the wrong thing about one of the Kitsons, or it's one of these contested, bruised areas which developed. And I got violently denied by somebody who afterwards turned out to have been a boss agent. I can't remember what his name was now. He was in charge of the
it could have been Gordon Winter.
No, it wasn't him, no. It was somebody else. Anyway.
Did you like South Africa? Did you like being a journalist there?
Yeah. I mean, you have moments of horror and wishing you were anywhere else, you know, occasionally. I mean, I think that you get terrible moments. That's inevitable. I got a bad time in Jan Smuts, actually, in the airport, because I got arrested at one point. Because they did this thing, they called it your visa exemption is withdrawn. It sounds all right. It's not. So I'm sort of locked into this tract until they can put me on a plane to anywhere else, you know. The next day.
Well, this was a bureaucratic culture that was able to invent phrases like foreign natives and so forth. So,
But I tell you something. I really learned all kinds of things in South Africa. And one of the things, I'm sorry.
No, go on.
One of the things I learned was about what I call the labour pump, which is how it works. And because, in fact, if you look carefully, you can see this in many parts of the world, in different contexts, which is that you have a developed, industrialised core. It needs labour. But because it's capitalist, it doesn't need labour. It's a steady pulse, you know. It goes up, and then suddenly you don't need it anymore. How do you get rid of it? You don't want to pay their unemployment benefit, you know. So they have to be sent back to their own countries. Suppose they don't have any countries. Suppose their country is your country, okay? You have to change that bit of your country into their country. You have to create foreign countries for them to go back and, you know, so you don't. And they have to take charge of their fate, see. So you have organised this, and you have to bring them in when you need them, and then when you don't need them, you look at how the economy is going back into their homelands where somebody else has to pick up the tab, you know, and then you bring them back when you need them. It's wonderful. Like this, you've got everything that you need, you see, the supply of labour, and you're saving money on their expenses and everything. And it's terrific. The rule is that labour pumps leak. They all leak. And this is what the Germans did, you see, the West Germans. Because they set up the labour pump system initially with Portugal, Italy, Yugoslavia, you know, and eventually with Turkey. And they thought, originally these people were all just like South Africa, they were all on sort of fictional contracts. Well, fictional, they were supposed to be on a contract, so that when their services weren't needed, right, they could be sent back. Of course, it leaked. And within a few years, I had 1 million Turks living in West Germany.
It's a very good image. And you
But that's a system, you know. I've realised that this is one of the ways in which capitalism works. It needs, you know, really foreign countries of a far lower standard of living in a periphery. And this is how you operate, if you can. But in the long term, it never keeps working. It always blocks, leaks.
Yeah.
They settle.
I'm going to borrow that image for my teaching. Thank you very much. I like it. The pump, and you formulated
The
that
leaky
in
pump.
the leaky pump. You formulated that in South Africa. It wasn't in. You came to that view in South Africa and then applied it to Germany. It wasn't the other way around.
Yeah, no, in South Africa.
Yeah. Always dignified as in theoretical terms as the cheap labour thesis or the rural subsidy or the migrants and so forth. But I like the pump. I like the pump. It's a good one.
The labour pump.
Particularly the leaky one. The
Yeah.
leaks.
Okay, let's move to poor little Britain. Here we are. 12th of March. I suppose the general question I have really is about what connections you think about the end of empire and Brexit. Because by and large, the journalists, the main journalist trope really is that there's this nostalgia for empire or loss of empire, and that explains Brexit, which I've never been won by, because I think it explains everything and explains nothing, that it's so abstract, and it needs, if one's going to follow that route, it needs kind of hitting. But you sent me that the piece from 1985 on Westland. Do you remember that?
Vaguely.
And you begin saying that during the Westland crisis, you just couldn't. You fell about laughing at the cynicism and the pantomime and the appalling nature of the British government. Well, blimey, 20 years on, or 30 years on it is, or 40 years, whatever, things are even worse.
Well, and Heseltine is, rather than being a pantomime act, now seems like the kind of lost elder statesman that has sort of redolent of a much greater moment of British politics.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I have struggled to be convinced about a connection between loss of empire and Brexit. I don't think that the English people's reaction in 2016 referendum is particularly post-imperial. I think it is a reversion to old attitudes of traditionally fairly mild xenophobia, but an intense dislike of the idea that somebody else is ruling the English and that somebody else is making their laws. Exactly what Enoch Powell predicted would happen. And I suppose you could say, stretching it a bit, that what Powell was saying was, well, in his kind of 1950s and early 60s, he said, I see, the English are still nostalgic about empire. They go on whining about their great world position, that we're still a world power, and so on and so forth. Snap out of it.
Yeah.
Because it is over. It is over. It doesn't mean that he was not deeply, passionately proud of the British Empire. Of course, he was parties, and his wife Helen, who was a tremendous goer, very lively, and his ADC, he was a charming fellow. And so we knew each other anyway.
You also, I think, knew, you mentioned David Apter, the political scientist,
Yeah.
who's written about that episode of the Kabaka. And if I remember correctly, Apter says that Cohen basically fires the Kabaka in an attempt to bring a modern nation into being, but this misfires terribly. This backfires as the Kabaka stages a revival. Were you involved in that, or did you have a view of that
Yes,
episode?
I think I forget exactly what happened, but I think that's true. It certainly it was kind of disabling for Andrew Cohen that he felt he had to do this. He didn't want to do it, as a matter of fact. I don't think the impulse, I think the impulse came from the Colonial Office. And eventually he had to obey orders. That's how I understood it. But he lost an enormous amount of affection and prestige among young Ugandans at that point, who before had liked and trusted him.
And at a broader level,
Yeah.
I mean, you'd been in Malaya. Did you have a view? Did you have a view about African national independence?
I had a view about everybody's independence. I mean, having been in Malaya and seen it, well, having seen, I mean, on the way out, because in those days you went out in a troop ship, took a month. So you went through a succession of British colonial contacts. First of all, the Canal Zone, you know, oh my God, and then Aden, and then, you know, brief halt in Colombo, and then finally Singapore, and then up into the peninsula. So yeah, I'd already seen quite a lot. I've seen the way that people who got on board at Liverpool, who were insignificant, boring little people, as soon as you got through into the canal, they suddenly began to somehow swell in size and strut and put on khaki shorts and tell you things in local dialects. And I remember going with an abominable little guy like that in Aden, and we were surrounded by little boys asking for money and so on. He said, "I'll show you something. They're all superstitious." And, it's just if you give them the, what you call it, it's not the devil sign, it's the black, what's the word? It's that.
The gesture?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's just the expression's gone out of my head. Anyway, you do that, and you just watch, and he did that, and they went grey, shrank, disappeared, and he sort of laughed in a contented way. I really hated him. That was the start of it. When you got to Malaya, of course, you saw what a colonial situation was made of. And in that particular context, it was made of the disenfranchisement of half the population. The Chinese, who were not allowed to vote, they were out with the whole state provision. If they wanted hospitals, they had to build them themselves. They wanted schools, they had to organise and build them themselves, and so on. So all that, and also.
But can I just ask, because this is very, very interesting. I'm just trying to, we've talked about Scotland a bit. I mean, do you have, at that point, would you say, you're giving us wonderful texture and the racism and the description that you're just giving us, that kind of casual sense of superiority. Did you have a view about African national independence? You'd been in Malaya, you were obviously aware of India, you were a child of Scotland. Did you feel that all of Africa needed, deserved, required independence,
Yes.
or were you had a view?
Oh, it seemed absolutely obvious.
Obvious, yeah.
Yeah, I thought, empire is crap, wrong. I should have maybe thought about it more deeply, about the imperial mission and improving people's lot and were they ready and all this stuff. But to be honest, I never did. It just seemed so obvious. People ought to be independent. Of course, in the case of Uganda, it turned out with some bitter ironies.
I've got a couple of things to ask specifically about Malaya. You arrived in you disembarked in Singapore in 1950 or 51? And
51, yeah.
And you say that, or you give the impression that you were unsettled by, the white population, that you didn't fit in, and you knew you didn't fit in. Do you have any memory of how the white settlers talked about the defeat of Singapore? Was that still an active memory at that time amongst the settlers?
I thought about that, and the answer is I never ever came across anybody who
mentioned
talked about it. I'm sure there were intelligent people and colonial civil servants in Singapore and Malaya who thought deeply about it. I haven't met anybody except only in the context of some intense bitterness towards Sikhs in particular. The Sikh population, not very big, but they were used in a particular role. They were kind of policemen, junior police officers, and they were very large, brutal, and they had evidently worked with some enthusiasm with the Japanese and led to the arrest, disappearance, death of quite a lot of white people, probably, apparently. Anyway, they were resented.
Right.
It was still being used in that role once more.
Right.
But basically, everybody had attempted just to return to as it all was before.
I'm interested in the silences which the imperial burden reproduced and carried. So it is interesting for me that was the defeat of Singapore was just not talked about. The question which follows from that, you must have seen some horrible things and probably did some horrible things in Malaya. When you found you came back to the metropole, back to Britain, were you able to talk to anyone, or when you were coming back on the ship, did you talk amongst yourselves about what had happened, or was it, there are these stories about people coming back from men coming back from the war and actually couldn't speak about it at all to their families. I just wonder if there was something similar on your return from...
I had a sort of breakdown on the ship coming back, in fact, because the commander was being transferred to Malta. And I don't remember exactly how it was, but I remember I was in floods of tears because I felt there was nobody I was trying to tell somebody, I think it was either the medical officer or a padre, that I couldn't find anybody I could talk to who understood, nothing like that. And whoever it was quite cheerful and said, never mind, you'll soon be back in Britain and everything will be different, you'll be okay. But that was, I remember that, and probably that was just the usual kind of post-conflict stress.
And then you came back to Britain, and were people curious about Malaya and what you'd been doing? And
vaguely, not all that much. I mean, the thing was, I'm part of a generation who'd all been doing this. I mean, something I do remember vividly is I'd been at an officer cadet school during my national service, and because the Marines very reluctantly had to do officer cadet training with the army, and known a lot of people there. And when we came to the end of the course, there was our postings. So we were all assembled, all my platoon, there was about 50 boys in a hut, and the officer then read out our postings. Now, what had happened, we Royal Marines, we were exempt. The Royal Marines told us what we were going to do, but they had all chosen to be in their daddy's old regiment or something like that, and in fact, as he read out, silence, really, because every single one of them was sent to a battalion going to Korea.
Wow.
And they took no notice of a choice at all. And then, whatever it was, 2 years later, I was here, and the first lecture I went to, the first few days I was there, I was in the Mill Lane lecture rooms, and a whole mass of mostly boys, one or two girls no doubt, but all jostling outside the doors before they were open to get into the amphitheatre. And I recognised one or two, we recognised each other. I said, what happened? You know, and I didn't realise how many people had been killed, you know, how many people didn't make it. Awful lot, because of Korea.
There's a new book out, incidentally, by Christopher Bailey, posthumous.
Sorry?
Chris Bailey, Remaking the Modern World. It's sad, posthumous. He died in 2015. It's a history of the 20th century. And one of the arguments that he makes in the book, he tries to re-periodize the Second World War. The Second World War for him begins in the 30s with Abyssinia and also with Manchuria. And it doesn't end in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. He talks about small wars of fragmentation or wars from below. He includes Malaya. He's thinking of Korea. He's talking about, it's really a history of the 20th century told from the point of view of war and violence. And he's arguing in a sense that the war continues, seen at a global level, way past 45.
Well, I mean, I think that's overlooking the sheer scale and intensity of World War II. I've just been out last week in Dieppe and took a book with me about the Dieppe raid, 1942. Oh my God, you know what happened there and what didn't have to happen. Oh, I mean, of course there were small wars went on, but the colonial wars. I wouldn't say that they're part of an identifiable continuum, a single long event starting in the 30s and going through into the 50s.
No, he's not saying it's a single event, and obviously, but he's trying to decenter the European-Eurasian War and to talk about a much longer cycle of violence. But I mean, I'm just throwing this out because, in a sense, you're in Malaya. I think you're in Cyprus. You're in Aden as well. So you've encountered several hot post-colonial hotspots.
Arcadia too. Saw that in the Mau Mau period.
Right.
Briefly. Had to go across it to get to Uganda.
Right.
And then, of course, much later, Rhodesia, Namibia, or Southwest Africa as it was in South Africa and so on. But that was much later.
Yeah.
As a journalist.
So by then you were working for the Observer or the Scotsman?
Well, both, in fact. Part of the time Observer, and then for another part of the time the Scotsman.
And what was the ethos of those two newspapers? You obviously knew Astor, David Astor.
Yeah.
You've said that you were almost an instinctive supporter of post-colonial independence. Did you, around the newsroom, were there that kind of sympathy in the Observer and in the Scotsman?
Oh yeah, 150%. I mean, that was one of the interesting things about the Observer. It had three, under David Astor, starting I suppose in the 50s, it developed three aims that it wanted to see. One was decolonisation of the British Empire. Two was a peaceful settlement between East and West in the Cold War. And the third was, odd as it sounds, planification in the French mode. So the Observer was derided and in fact was detested by British governments, particularly Tory governments, because of its passion for African nationalism, you know. And we had this superb correspondent, Colin Legion, who you may have come across,
cool.
Yeah, who was, admirable man, hugely arrogant, but wonderfully well connected, and he knew.
He founded the Africa Bureau, didn't he?
No, Michael Scott did.
Michael Scott, but did he not work with the Africa Bureau after Scott?
I think, it's funny you say that. I think he was slightly distant about the Africa Bureau. See, Michael Scott was the person who got to David Astor first,
right,
and said, you must understand what is happening. in South Africa, above all, and put him onto the whole, then developed the whole feeling about decolonisation really came out of that.
So Scott was particularly interested in Namibia and was one of the key people in taking the Namibia question to the Michael Scott.
Oh, Michael Scott, yes.
Was one of the key people in publicising the Namibia issue at the United Nations.
He was, but also, I think also South Africa.
And South Africa, yeah.
Later,
Yeah.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Did you ever meet him?
Yes, I did. He's quite a forbidding person to meet. Sort of silent, gaunt, rather intimidating. And of course his extraordinary reputation, so we were all in awe of him.
You never met Mary Benson by any chance, did you?
Yeah, I have, yes.
Because I just read her autobiography. I should have read it earlier, and she had a sort of a platonic love affair with Michael Scott.
Yes, I know nothing about how far that went, but one thing, I mean, she was quite a warm human being, I remember.
She's quite clear it went nowhere, because she said that Michael Scott made it a condition of their relationship that there would be or could be nothing personal. That's the word, but
yes, I can believe that.
yeah. But so he had a charisma.
He had an extraordinary charisma. I mean, he was very lonely, and you felt that.
He was very ill as well.
Yeah, he was, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I think that's right. But the Africa Bureau, there was a kind of nest of subversive organisations in a place called Denison House, which is a scabby old building somewhere on the corner of Victoria Street, near Victoria Station, and it contained all kinds of things. Like what's the Organisation for Democratic Control? Commander Tommy Fox Pitt, and the Aboriginal Protection Society, and all these people. They all knew each other, of course, and intercommunicated with them. But the Africa Bureau was probably the most important and central tenant of that block.
And did you have I mean, by now, just before the wind of change, Central Africa Federation, crisis, did you have a sort of view of a sort of sequence of what had to happen before Rhodesia, South Africa, Mozambique, those late decolonizing states should fall? I mean, did you?
Yes, I mean, obviously I saw the British Empire version of decolonisation, how it happened, and the hauling down of the flag and shaking hands and all this gentlemanly handover and so on, pretending that unpleasant events had never happened and all that. But I'd also been in Algeria, and
When were you in Algeria?
well, twice in Algeria. But the first time, much the most important to me, was at the end of the war. It was at the time of the ceasefire, when things were coming to. Actually, the killing was reaching intensity it hadn't hardly touched before, because it was involved in the struggle with the OAS as well, FLN, French army. Everybody was trying to kill everybody, and Algiers was. I was just writing up my diaries, oddly enough, a few days ago. Went back to them and I typed them up. So I've just finished typing up my memories of Algeria. But again, yeah, you look at that and you see, well, you learn a few things, particularly about a settler community, in which there are settler communities in which the settlers find a way to make their peace with the situation, and others where they bloody well don't. And of course, as you know, what happened in Algeria, which is 900,000 Pieds Noirs, who only a minority was of French background, really, bolted and landed up in France. 90,000, well, I don't know how many, the Harki, of whom the FLN probably killed about 50,000, and some 90,000 got to France.
I just want to go back. We're sitting in Cambridge.
Yeah.
I want to go back to this thing you've talked about many times before. When you arrived in King's on your first night, and you were wearing some insignia from the Royal Marines.
A medal, yeah.
A medal, and then there's that engagement with Hobsbawm, and it's a very moving story, very moving episode. But you tell it in different ways. And the last version I've read is you say that you were wearing it in the kind of, or with the unconscious hope that someone would tell you to take it off.
Yes.
But when you were just saying a moment ago that actually on the ship back you had a kind of breakdown, how do you put those two things together, or do you not put them together?
Well, I don't think they were the same at all. I mean, my kind of breakdown on the ship, I couldn't really understand why I felt like I did at the time. I just felt, nobody understands me, and there's nobody I can talk to, and nobody reads books. I like my Marine officer comrades and all that sort of thing, but sometimes you can't communicate with them. Of course, obviously, looking back, there was a lot more behind it. I was already, perfectly well aware after a month or two in Malaya that the situation was an unjust one. I wouldn't say so far as I felt I'm on the wrong side,
Right.
but I felt that the other side had a point, put it like that.
So
I wrote letters to my mother about this, saying, could you show, because she knew a Tory MP, who was quite an intelligent man. Actually.
who was that?
He was called Cedric Drew, undistinguished but a nice guy, and said, well, you want to read this? I want him to, understand how bad the situation is and how it could be remedied, what could be done to create some justice for the Chinese community above all. So I was already involved in trying to change things. So I had, but I suppose deeper than that, was a feeling that, okay, you can write nice letters saying this is all wrong, but the fact is the next morning you're going to go out with a gun and do the thing. And so that's what eventually catches up with you, I suppose.
But when you arrived in Cambridge, are you persuaded by your own explanation that you wanted, or you needed other people to tell you to take off the
yes,
medal?
in retrospect, it was afterwards I sort of looked at my own behaviour over this incident with Eric Hobsbawm, and I realised that I just felt you'd been asking, why did you put that thing on? It was a provocation. Didn't you realise it was a provocation, So,
To which you thought, when he said that, what did you think?
well, it wasn't conscious provocation, but looking back subconsciously, I was looking for somebody to say, what you did was wrong,
Right. And then Daniel Ellsberg was there as well.
Yeah, but it took me sort of 30 or 40 years before either of us picked up that we'd both been there, yeah.
Going back, just picking up this idea of the sympathetic or the Tory MP, what did you make of the sort of liberal Tories, if one can call them, the MacLeods, and running up to Macmillan and so forth, Wind of Change? Did you take them seriously?
Yes,
you did.
yes. I was on the Scotsman then, and I was their Commonwealth correspondent for one terrific year based in London, which was the year 1959 through 60. It was a great year because all sorts of things were happening. And it was the year of the Ascherson riots, which finally it was the first real big nail in the coffin of the Central African Federation. And this was done by the Scotsmen, really, because it wasn't my agency, but the thing was that as soon as the riots exploded, the British government went into sort of panic mode, really, because they could see the implications. If this was going to happen, the Federation was going to work, because it all depended on, black Nyasaland submitting to white-dominated southern Rhodesia. If they didn't do that, the whole none would work, and then northern Rhodesia, also black, would go up as well with the copper belt. So they were panicking. So they immediately locked down everything, and there were no communication, no journalists were allowed there. I think the post stopped all kinds of things, and state of emergency, and the British government put out an extraordinary series of documents, which I think were fake actually, about a murder plot.
Yeah.
Which, you remember that? And at that point, of course, as you know, Nyasaland is very special to Scotland, because it's Livingstone,
of course.
did a lot of his work, and it's where the Church of Scotland then settled in. So the place is covered with Scottish place names, Blantyre, Livingstone, the rest of it. And so what happened was that Eric Mackay, was then the London editor, later was the editor, got the idea. He said, well, of course I know a lot of these people there, and I was at school with them, Aberdonians, and so we decided to ring up the Reverend Andrew Doig, I can't remember, Livingstone or somewhere. So they booked a telephone call, and it took 3 days to come through. But he did come through, and I'm sorry, I'm going on too long.
No, it's a great story, please.
We all, when it came through, and Eric received the phone, we all crowded into the open door of his office, like that, and it was all, hello, Andrew, is that yourself? Aye, oh, very well, and how's she? Oh, so very bonny, aye, that was great, wow, very, very good. Oh, Andrew, finally, he got through, and he got down to it, and Andrew Doig started dictating these absolutely devastating series of articles in the Scotsman about exactly what was happening, which was ferocious repression, and a lot of pack of lies being put out by the Colonial administration. We started printing this. Immediately, British government reacted, and then after about 2 or 3 days of this, we were sent for by, it was then Lord Hume, who was the Commonwealth Secretary, and so we went to see him in his office, in the Foreign Office building, great dim chamber, and he kept sort of trying to make us stop publishing. He asked Eric to stop publishing this stuff, and Eric was just so angry he couldn't speak. Just sat on the sofa, his face frozen like that. And I remember Lord Hume walking up and down the room, wringing his hands, or whatever you call it, like that, and saying, "I appeal to you as fellow Scotsmen."
And what was Hume? Was it did it get to a point where he denied or said that the reports were inaccurate, or was it? No. So it was simply that they were inconvenient.
To shut up.
Want you to shut up? Yeah, yeah.
But
Did you cover the Devlin Commission?
I think he may have said it was irresponsible or only encouraged further disorder or something like that. You know, the usual things they say.
But at the beginning of 1961, there was that great rebellion in the Conservative Party in Westminster amongst Walensky's supporters.
Yeah, he's an imperialist, but he's also historically imaginative. He said this period is ending. We're entering another period in which the English have to stop thinking of themselves as a great global supernation. You've got to concentrate on Englishness. Concentrate until you have something so intense, living and hard and brilliant, you know, that it will then perhaps again expound and do something incredible across the world. But for the moment, that's what you've got to do, because, you know, the big global Britain is for the moment over. So it may be that in a funny way, he always said membership of the EEC, the European Community, will never stick with the English. Sooner or later they'll say no, because they don't like being ordered about by foreigners. Very simple.
I mean, in 1961, he gave this speech on St George's Day, which Tom then uses a lot in the breakup of Britain. And I've gone back and read it, and he talks about at the heart of England there is this memory of a vanished empire, which is wonderful. That's not nostalgia for empire. And he was imperialist and colonial in his bones till he died. But you're absolutely right, he jettisoned all that, and he gives that speech at the moment that Macmillan is with Kennedy in Washington, discussing with Kennedy, is it going to be okay with the State Department if we join the EEC? Yeah? So there was something extraordinarily and horribly prescient about Enoch Powell.
Yes.
And out of that comes an entire racialized kind of ethnic populism, a kind of xenophobia, and it's not that happened before in England. It happened in 1912 during the crisis about Ireland and so on. And I think there are continuities. They're interrupted, but there are continuities in different moments about a racialized right-wing people against the state. Yeah, and I would prefer to see Brexit in that lineage rather than some amorphous, abstract, unprovable nostalgia for empire.
Yes, well, I absolutely agree with that, and I like the way that you bring up 1912, because 1912 to 14 is the previous occasion to Brexit, to what we're going through now.
Well,
when Parliament entirely lost control of a complex situation. In fact, there are three complex situations in 1912 to 14, which were converging, that Bacon saved by the war. This time, not so. But it's interesting that happened exactly as you say. I mean, there is a precedent, but it's the only time when things happen when Parliament simply, the party system backs up.
No one had any idea what to do in 1912-14. I've just, after 40 years, I went back and I read George Dangerfield in order to understand what 1912 was about. Actually, reading it in Brexit times, it's like reading a commentary on the contemporary period. I mean, it is absolutely formidable. And then, of course, when there is the kind of return of the repressed, and the only way Mrs. May can survive is with the bloody DUP, I mean, the continuities are just extraordinary. Except, as Fintan O'Toole argues in his book, there's no way that the DUP is representative of anything apart from a tiny little coterie of old reactions.
You have to stop and think, just a minute, just a minute. What matters here, you have a majority of the population in Northern Ireland for whom being separate from the UK to the extent of being part of the customs union doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They don't. In some ways it's a wee bit worrying, but it's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's not, and yet they are being entirely monopolistically ruled by this tiny group of little bits of Antrim granite, who are laying down the law and dominating the situation, and it is idiotic. Now, it's easy to say, well, okay, Northern Irish people, you all voted not to be in this situation. You didn't vote for the people who are putting you in this situation. So get down in the street and do something. The trouble is in Northern Ireland, if you go down in the street, those people start hitting each other.
Yeah.
So, I see that it's difficult.
Yeah.
There's an argument for being passive, but it is ludicrous.
Yeah.
Well, I personally don't think the backstop is really what this is about. I think this has become the way in which it's.
I don't think it's about anything which people are saying it's about. It's not only the backstop. It's not Europe. I just think it becomes a vessel for everyone's anxieties. Which is partly why it's impossible, as Ireland was in 1912 to 1914.
Yes.
It's when politics just overflows and it becomes more complex than the institutions can handle. That's the situation we're in.
Another thing which has struck me about this is Mrs. May talking constantly about our precious, precious union. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly realised she means what she says. It's the union which is precious. She doesn't give us stuff about Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland.
No, she
but
doesn't.
The union she does care about, because it's a kind of abstract achievement vaguely on which her authority and her, style depends, the crown and the jewel and the crown, whatever it is. So she does care about the union.
But the union, it's just become in her mind a red line. I mean, she doesn't understand it. She doesn't travel. She doesn't have any political sensibility outside it. She's a very. I mean, can you think of another prime minister with such little ability to self-reflect or historical?
I can think one of the nicest ones, who is John Major. Who I did have a conversation with him when he was Prime Minister. It lasted about 5 minutes or something, and it was about devolution to Scotland, which was then, in the air or approaching or thought about. And he said to me, look, I mean, all this devolution talk, it's rather loopy, really, because I know what it is. The Scots just feel left out of things up there, and I ought to go there more often. And I really must tell my cabinet ministers that they should go there more often.
It sounds like Prince Charles, doesn't it? It's exactly like Prince Charles. That.
It's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, I couldn't say anything. Thought,
But there's, the thesis which you and Tom Nairn and Sandra put about the kind of archaic nature of the British government and the way the parliamentary sovereignty just builds up the executive and breaks completely any sense of popular sovereignty. I mean, I'm going to have to read this out. This is from the same bit you wrote during the Western Crisis, when you talked about how Mrs. Thatcher ran her cabinet. Yeah? And he says, Mrs. Thatcher's way of running her cabinet is in the manner of Stalin running his evening parties at the Dakar. She winds up the gramophone, her ministers dance together, outside in the snow, the van for Siberia, waits with the engine running. I mean, honestly, that made me laugh. It chilled my blood as well. Because what you see in Mrs. Thatcher and her dependence on the executive, of course, is redoubled now with Mrs. May. You know, she and Ollie are the only people in the cabinet. You know, these other people she doesn't even care about. She can't handle. It is catastrophe.
These contradictions. I mean, the great sort of dialectic contradiction about Mrs. Thatcher was precisely, you know, she wanted to shrink the state, free everything up, you see. People who want to shrink the state, expand the state.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's like, I always feel that they say, well, what we want is a free market, unregulated market. It's exactly the unregulated market which need the police. You have a regulated market where everybody knows whose store is this Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. It's more or less okay. But once you say, well, you know, I'll leave it to you, you know,
you need the strong state.
Mr. Big is going to be there in no time, and there are going to be fights, and you need far more police.
You need a strong state.
You need a regulated one.
You do. And you need a strong state to run a free economy.
That's right, exactly. And this is Ascherson, you know, the other part of it, with of course the withdrawing of power from local authorities, you know, in favour of the central state.
When you talked about Mrs. May's unionism, you know, what she imagines by that, I fear there's a terribly easy answer to what her unionism involves, and it's certainly not Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. It pains me to say this, it's Maidenhead. You know, that is what she regards as the unionism. It is a kind of displaced nationalism, English nationalism.
I'd put in a word for Eastbourne.
No, I have to keep it at Maidenhead because
it sounds better.
Well, you said, I think, no, just the feeling. I mean, look, okay, let's go back to this thing about empires, embers of empire and ghosts of empire and so on. I mean, there is undeniably, empire has left something. It's left a feeling that Britain, call it Britain, is not just a nation state like other nation states.
Well, I would agree with you, and this is where I think that I don't think...
Hold on, did you finish?
Sorry.
No, I mean, well...
Go on, so you can come on.
You know, the idea that this is just a medium-sized nation state like France, Spain, Poland, you know, deep down, certainly English people don't really accept that in their feelings. And why they don't? I mean, there is an argument. It could be that English exceptionalism has really profound roots, as Powell thought it did.
Yes, but that's not
It could be, you know, just a afterglow of being a victor power of World War II and having had a global empire.
Yes.
You know.
But that's not an argument for nostalgia for empire. It is no. Empire is then an element in how that memory coalesces. But it's not an argument for nostalgia for empire.
No,
because
look,
there's stages of displacement.
When I was a school child, I certainly remember. I can't remember how old I was, thinking at some point, I don't believe it. Why am I, Neal Ascherson, part of the most important, wonderful, good nation that ever existed in the world? Why am I so privileged?
Did you think that?
Yes. Yes.
I'm definitely a post-colonial child. I never thought that. Sorry, we interrupted you.
Yeah. Well,
No. I was only going to say that I mean, Bill's written a great deal about nostalgia. I mean, I think that the reason why nostalgia doesn't quite explain it is nostalgia needs quite an elaborate story and actually a joined-up historical consciousness, which I think is lacking. What I think we have now are examples of imperial reflexes, a sort of an angry reflex which comes out at various points which isn't very joined up. So when you have the Defence Secretary talking one moment about putting sending the new aircraft carrier to face up to China, and the next moment to putting the military on the streets to deal with knife crime, you're dealing both with an impoverished political mind, but also with someone who is dealing with reflexes. This is not joined up thinking, and it's made all the more tragic in these circumstances where the political class simply cannot respond in a coherent way. And I do think there are examples of imperial nostalgia which intrude. And the Second World War for me is more, we talked about this in Brexit, the memory of the Blitz and so forth is more part of what is being imagined. But of course the Second World War was also a denial of empire and a claim on empire.
An affirmation as well, as it denied it. Yeah.
But, nobody, no matter how you explain the glories of the Blitz, and we know from all the novels and so forth that it was never quite so simple as it's made out, form of solidarity, that Britain didn't vote to be bombed. And what we're going through now is an act of national self-harm, and that is what I can't understand.
Well, that's Fintan O'Toole's argument.
Yeah.
Have you read the Fintan O'Toole book?
Sorry?
Have you read the Fintan O'Toole book?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Isn't it wonderful? What do you think?
I think it's a lovely book. It's a wonderful book. I think it's over the top about. No, I mean I just
It is
feel
over the
he's sort of slightly holding on to his feet as he flew up when he talked about how what the English really want is to be occupied by a vicious foreign nation who lock them all in concentration camps. I thought that was going a wee bit too far.
I think he knows that. I think he
I like
was.
it.
Yes, I do.
I like it, but it's very good. Yeah.
But there is a self. I mean, I've always felt that there is something about an Englishness. I don't know whether it's a perverted form of a particular dilute kind of Calvinism, which believes if it isn't hurting, it's not working. I mean, I think that was an underestimated element of Thatcherism, and I've never been able to quite explain or understand that. Do you know?
It wasn't working.
If it's not hurting, it isn't working.
Oh, I see.
And I think that's part of what Fintan is getting at.
No, it is, because he's talking
Well,
about the
there's
self-harm.
there's an element of that. There's an element of that. And one of the things which the the Remainers got wrong, of course, and they're still getting wrong actually, is that nobody voted to get poorer, and it's the economy stupid, because of course the more you know about the Leave vote, the more you realise that people were perfectly clear about the danger to the economy and to their standard of living, that there was one. It would probably mean rough years, but they thought it worthwhile for political ends. This is a political vote.
Yeah, well, that's been made very clear in Sunderland and many other places. Well, we're almost heading towards the witching hour of 7 o'clock.
I've got a couple of final questions, if that's right. Are you still up for it?
I'll try and answer them
You don't.
quickly.
The first one, you don't have to answer them, but I'm going to put them. You don't have to answer them at all.
Sure.
Let's just. Can we go back? So here you are, aged 12 or something, when you go to Eton College, yeah? You come from the relatively comfortable middle class, would that be
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Relatively comfortable middle class.
Oh,
You
for
go
sure.
to Eton, you then join the Royal Marines, you end up at King's College, Cambridge University.
Yeah.
You know, that is a biography which we've seen in, 1,000 times, of centred politicians, and then they go on to law or politics or whatever. Yep. And my question is, to what extent has your affiliation to Scotland been a way of decentering yourself?
Yes.
That's my question.
It has been a part. Yes, I think so, because my reaction to Well, it wasn't just to Eton, but it was to the kind of anglicised British upper classes, was that I didn't want to be like that. I didn't want to be identified with them. And so, yes, I mean, even when I was at Eton, I was trying consciously to associate with other Scottish boys, for example.
Yeah.
And to, not to do things which would identify me with that kind of life or that kind of culture. And so Scottishness certainly has been something to hold on to, because here I am. Yes, as you say, I am Scottish. I was entirely educated in England.
Yeah.
Not only that, because I was a scholarship boy, both, to Eton and then from Eton to King's, I owe it all to one English Plantagenet king, Henry VI, and his endowments. It was quite ironic. But, I mean, to be fair, I have, getting slowly the other side of all this, as it were, to old age, a more balanced view, a more ironic view. I have become much more of a fan and admirer of Englishness in many ways.
Have you?
Than I was before. Yeah, I mean, Tom Nairn is he really is quite sharply critical. I mean, he does find English not only foreign but in some ways deplorable. He's got many English friends, of course, but I've come to appreciate what England is and has a lot.
Oh, that's interesting.
Can you just say something more about that? What is it you appreciate?
Well, one of the things you said, I mean, I've had a long exposure in my life to Scottish politics, for example. And Scottish politics are rather like Polish politics or French politics, or Irish politics even, not quite as dirty as Irish politics. But the tolerance of the English is pretty remarkable, and it's insofar as tolerance exists in Scottish politics, it's an import commodity,
Is it?
Yeah.
And you're saying this even in these very intolerant times?
Yes, it's still there, really, and it's almost to do with a kind of indifference.
Mm-hmm.
It's to do with that people have to imagine foreigners they hate, because they can't actually get round to hating the foreigners they know and meet. And that's always been a bit of an English thing. But the fact that nobody cares who the fuck you are, living next door, or they keep themselves to themselves. Yes, it's true, I occasionally see them going out covered with black veils, balaclavas, and carrying AK-47s. But, that's their business. I mean, they're very quiet at night, they don't give us any bother. Good. And that kind of thing, and no, I mean, there's not a lot of that in the world.
Okay.
There really isn't. It's not just being incurious, it's about,
Laissez-faire?
well, English people are kind in a way. I mean, Scottish people are very kind. But they're particularly, what I'm curious about Scotland is that I think Scottish people find it much easier to be kind to strangers than to each other.
Gosh.
I mean, why that is so is a long story, but in England, I think people instinct is to be kind.
I would never regard English people for their kindness, and certainly not for their kindness to strangers. It's not something which I recognise.
I think I know what you're saying, and I think there's a kind of tolerance which comes out of an instinct for incorporation, and a form of incorporation which never amounts to full assimilation. So the British traditions of indirect rule were different from the French idea, Republican idea of assimilation, where you had to actually deal with the possibility. I mean, you were talking about Algeria, that foreigners could become us.
Yeah.
I don't think the English have ever really thought that foreigners should become us.
No.
But they're relatively easy about foreigners being amongst us. And I think that, for me, is the way I think about this. Whether it's kindness or whether it's a kind of apathetic incorporation, I don't know.
I don't know, when you read sort of people's memoirs, often of arriving here as refugees and how they've been treated. Of course, there are bad cases, but a lot of cases are just people still 70 years on, just amazed at how people were, how good people were to them, you know. Not so much financially or anything, but just...
But wasn't that also, you know, a 30s moment and a kind of belief in British constitutionalism and Westminster, and the ability to... I hear what you're saying, but I wonder whether that wasn't a very particular... It's true the Ugandan Asians would say that as well in the 70s. Not much about if you're on the south coast towns.
But it's also partly the predicament of, you know, where you come from. And if it's from Idi Amin to end up in Gloucestershire, I can see how that would be desirable. Neil, I've got one last question, which again you can choose to answer or not. It's a stupid question, but stupid questions don't always produce stupid answers. If you were asked what kind of European you are, how would you begin to answer that question?
Mongrel.
Mongrel.
Mongrel and emotional. I'm a European. I just have felt enormously proud, really, to feel that I'm part, you know, through the European Union, actually organically connected now for the next 10 days or whatever it is to, you know, my Polish friends or people I know in Madrid. It means a lot to me. I've also got a lot of French relations for various reasons. I've grown up with a lot of French family, but well, that's part of it too. But it's more. It's not a feeling of being European against anything or anybody or anywhere else. Not even being the. And it may be that that's un-European, because you know, I've always noticed that almost every European country thinks it's the last bastion of European civilization against the next one east. You know,
But why do you think?
I don't feel that.
Why do you think that those sentiments, which are not unique to you, why do you think those sentiments have been so difficult to mobilise and articulate in the whole discussions about Europe? Because you know, I've hardly heard a single soul
Well, I think it's
say
because
what you've just said on ever on TV.
well, that's going back to Europhobia and so on in England. Again, I think England's a special case here. It's part of the sense of control, whether you think that being European is your relationship with other European countries and civilizations is something that you are in charge of, that you can affect. English people clearly don't feel that at all. Scottish people, I think, do, in a quiet sort of way. one of the things that was struck about France, for example, is that France, intensely nationalist, arrogant culture, after all, why is it so deeply European? And the answer is because, well, one of the answers is that the French consider they invented Europe. It's theirs. So in spite of everything, why do they, I mean, one of the things that, for instance, the British absolutely failed to understand, were baffled by, was after Maastricht, I guess, was that the French gave up the franc. Quite, well, a certain amount of moaning and groaning, but they gave it up. People here said, how could they? I mean, aren't they? Then they have this sort of patriotism more. And the French are supposed to be the most nationalistic people on earth. What is it? The answer is that, particularly since De Gaulle, but not only that, goes much, much further back to Napoleon, really. The French know deep down that they invented Europe.
Yeah.
They invented the European Union.
Yeah.
They invented, of course, Roman law under Napoleon, which spread all over Europe. It's theirs in some sense. Even if it turns against them, it's still,
I think
they have a sort of sense of ownership and, well, I don't know about control, but a sense of power.
I
They feel
think,
empowered by Europe.
the
The English don't feel empowered by Europe.
I think the antagonism between Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle is extremely symptomatic in that sense. Because de Gaulle was exactly that, and Churchill just was furious that anyone should feel like that. Whereas Churchill himself felt that he ran the Anglophone world, They couldn't talk to each other. For 30 years they couldn't, 15 years, 20 years, they couldn't talk to each other. I've just finished the Julian Jackson biography of de Gaulle. Have you seen that? It's very fine. Have you seen it? It's a terrific book.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and we worked you very hard, Neil. And
No, it's a pleasure.
it's been a real pleasure. It's
You've
been our
done-
pleasure.
You've been fabulous. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for talking. I mean, for asking questions.
I think the answers were probably better than the questions, actually.
I'm going to stop before we
Yeah.
flatter each
Yeah.
other too much. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, Neil.
Oh, thank you.